Alright, today's task. I've got a Retina IIa. This is here for servicing. Its most obvious problem is that the shutter blades are jammed open. A bit unusual. You can wind the advance. It'll click, but there's no action at the shutter blades at all. That's a little bit of an unusual problem. So I'm just crank out the focus to closest focus distance so I can watch the rack, and that part certainly is doing what you'd expect it to do. So I'm going to remove the shutter and investigate what's going on. So using my favourite tool, the Belgian tool, I'll loosen the retaining ring. Remove the shutter, pop the camera body to one side, here's our shims. We have two paper shims and a metal shim by the looks of it. I'll pop those carefully to one side with the retaining ring. We'll remove the rear lens group. You should just be able to unscrew those with your fingers. The front lens group. That little spacer washer, that has no function other than to cover the front surface here. It has no effect on the distance of the lens to the shutter that's set on this surface. Now, need to remove the front scale ring there, so undo that little lock screw, turn that and lift it off, lift off the shutter speed cam ring, and the blades you can see are jammed open. Let's remove the main drive ring. I'll just unhook the spring and we should be able to lift that out of the shutter. What can I see? Well, you can see the arm here is stuck in the blades open position. So we're no further ahead. Let's disassemble that shutter. This is a Compur Rapid shutter, as fitted to the earlier Retina IIas. Later cameras would have had a Synchro Compur instead. I'll throw some lights on this, I think. There you can see a bit better. I'll remove the outer casing, two screws, one that will locate the shutter in the camera body, which is something a feature earlier cameras lacked, and it was could make it a nuisance to get the shutter aligned correctly in the body in some cameras. One small screw there. That screw is quite short. Now, without pulling this much further away from the body, we need to loosen off this screw, and we should be able to pull out the wire. So there's our curved rack. Here's our outer case. This piece is the detents for the aperture settings. And we're further in than we need. Let's keep going. So I will back out that screw completely, that held the wire in place. It's a small black screw. Now there'll be a tiny black plastic spacer in there, and I'll see if I can encourage it to come out. It's easily lost, and I'm tired of cutting new ones. There it is. If you can see that speck there, that's about 1 millimetre long, perhaps 1.5 millimetres long, and about 0.5, 0.6 millimetres in diameter. Little cylindrical piece of plastic. Back to here. Let's see what we can do here. So, we'll remove this piece. This is the catch that holds the shutter in the cocked position. Single screw. Its return spring also bears up against this lever, which is the B lever. That serves to block the action of the main drive ring at the point of blades are fully open until such stage as you remove your finger from the shutter release, and then it allows the action to complete. A single screw here holds the flash sync contact in place. Small brass screw, and then with luck this assembly will lift out. Consists of 2 pieces. The fixed contact here is on that post, on that plastic piece, and here's the moving contact here, which is moved by the shutter blade, this arm here which moves the shutter blades. Okay, so that's looking pretty stripped down. I'll check the action of the speed cam, see if that swings in the retard gear train. That's all working, there's nothing wrong there. But the blades are most definitely jammed. So we will unhook their return spring so they stay where they're put while we open this up. Now I've got to be, the pointer here sticks out over the edge, so I've got to leave it sitting over the edge of my wooden block so I don't bend anything while I'm applying pressure to undo these screws. And I don't really know what I'm going to find inside here and why those blades are jammed up. They could simply be stuck with oil, that's certainly a possibility. The alternative is that a screw has backed out, a retaining plate screw has backed out inside and is jamming the blades. Let's have a look here. Well, you can see those blades lifted off with the outer case. And I can see, I don't know whether you can see, I can see a gleam of oil here. It's like a puddle of oil. It's very wet indeed. This blade is damaged at this point. It's actually distorted at that point. Whether somebody has already had a go at this, or whether that's a result of some previous repair, I don't know. Those blades shouldn't be sitting like that. They should have just fallen out. Pop that to one side. We'll check the mechanism plate. Can we swing this arm backwards and forwards freely? Well, we can. Would that have returned under spring tension? Most definitely. I wouldn't say that was exactly prompt and swift in moving, but it does move. So the problem was not that the blade actuating ring was jammed. It was certainly the blades themselves. I suspected that these screws on the retaining plate might have been loose and one of them might have jammed the blades. I'll check them to see if they're actually tight or loose. They're actually tight, so that certainly wasn't it. So the problem was oily blades. Now I haven't tried to move the aperture lever yet. I can move it, opening those blades up. It is quite stiff, which of course is another standard sign of oil. See if we can encourage these shutter blades out. They're just glued there. That's just what oil does. Yeah, they don't want to dislodge at all. You can possibly see the big smear of oil there. Now to be as oily as that, how did it get like that? Well, it could be oil that had effectively vaporized from the focus helical and settled in here, but there's a bit much in this case. I suspect that somebody has oiled the shutter. They are very, very oily blades. This will have to be completely stripped down. It would be anyway. It just means I have to be extra diligent at stripping it and cleaning it and getting rid of all traces of oil, because if I don't get rid of all traces of oil, they will, sooner or later, they will migrate their way back to where I don't want them to be. Right. So the mechanism plate, I'll strip that now. 3 screws. That screw wasn't loose, but it certainly wasn't over tight either. I quite commonly have to apply a great deal of force to stop my screwdriver camming out on those screws and slipping and making a mess of them. Those screws undid fairly easily. So they weren't too loose, but they by no means were they too tight. I'm looking at that plate. There's no obvious problem there on that plate. That retainer looks relatively clean. We lift out the blade actuating ring. It's a little bit grubby looking. It's not overly oily looking. And we'll remove, unhook that spring. And we'll remove this lever. That lever, of course, swings the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards in its arc of travel. That's as much as we need to strip that. Alright, let's look at the diaphragm. Now I'm being fairly cautious at shifting this because those blades could well be very sticky too, and diaphragm blades can be damaged permanently if someone forces them when they're stuck with oil. So I'll take out the 2 screws that hold the aperture setting lever ring in place. Remove that ring. We have 3 screws holding the retainer plate to the shutter case. We'll tip that out. It doesn't even want to come out. Right, so I poked it out with my finger. Let's have a look. So, the retainer. This is the moving piece that moves the pivots on those blades. Now I'm looking on there for oil and I really don't see any. So I don't think oil permeated the shutter from the back. I think it permeated the shutter from the front, and I think somebody probably gave it a squirt of something. The retainer plate, the diaphragm side of that, I can see a film of oil around the outside edge, but nothing on the surface. Where I can see oil, and heaps of it, is on the front surface of this retainer plate, where the shutter blades bears up against it. That tells me that the problem was really limited to the shutter blades, and for that to be the case, really somebody must have given it a squirt. These blades are all stuck together in a nice neat rosette, but that's quite normal. Even if they'd been dry, that would be the case. I'm looking at them to see if there's any sign of distortion around the rivets on the ends, because if these blades have been under a lot of force, they will get distorted, and typically you would see that the rivets are not sitting dead square with the blades. That looks fine. So all these components will need to be degreased very carefully and then reassembled. I don't immediately see any physical problems with the shutter, and I imagine that a good clean with appropriate lubrication as it's reassembled, and that shutter will be fine. But that looks to me to be an induced fault. If the shutter had a fault previously, it wasn't this. Somebody's introduced this fault. Perhaps they had a minor sticking problem from oil, and somebody gave it an extra good squirt because they thought it was running out. I'll show you later. Well, the shutter's almost back together now. What did I discover? Well, there was certainly oil on the shutter blades, and plenty of it. There was no great amount of oil on the diaphragm blades. There was certainly some, not a dramatic amount. There was very little oil to be seen in the rear, the control ring for the diaphragm, which leads me to believe that the oil found its way in from the front. The only obvious oil in serious quantity was on the shutter blades and on the retaining plate for the shutter blades, and on both sides. Certainly now that it's been cleaned and lubricated and serviced, the shutter is nice and snappy, and I've just got to finish off putting the outer case back on, and I'll pop that back on the body and test it just for good measure. But really, that shutter's done, no serious problems found there, and I'll get on to servicing the rest of the camera.